What kind of art could be so dangerous that it scared an entire regime? In 1937, the Nazis labeled modern art degenerate and tried to wipe it out. But why were they so freaked out by these weird, abstract pieces? Today, we're digging into what the Nazis didn't want you to see and why this art still matters. Alright, so let's set the stage. In the early 1930s, Germany was in complete chaos. The country had lost World War I, the economy was crashing, and people were desperate for change. Enter one of the silliest guys of the 20th century, Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party. By 1933, Hitler had risen to power, and from that moment on, the Nazis weren't just focused on taking control of politics, they wanted to control how people thought, felt, and lived. Basically, the Reddit mods of the 20th century. Everything from education to entertainment to culture had to fit into their vision of a new Germany. And art was right in the crosshairs. The Nazis believed in a very specific, idealized version of Germany. They wanted art that showcased their version of perfection, heroic, strong, and clean. Art that celebrated the so-called Aryan race and everything they stood for. But modern art? That was a big no for them. Movements like Expressionism, Dada, and Surrealism were full of abstract, experimental ideas the Nazis saw as chaotic and rebellious. To them, modern art wasn't just different, it was dangerous. It challenged their vision of order, unity, and racial purity. And it wasn't just about aesthetics. The Nazis saw modern art as a symbol of moral decay. They even linked it to their political enemies. They called it cultural Bolshevism, tying these art movements to communists, Jews, and other groups they wanted to suppress. In their eyes, this art wasn't just ugly or unconventional, it threatened everything they were trying to build in Nazi Germany. So, in 1937, they decided to make a spectacle out of it. The Nazis were big fans of burning stuff, so you'd think they would have taken these works of art, piled them up, and burned them. But apparently, the Nazi imagination wasn't only for figuring out the most insane ways to do crimes against humanity. They pulled together over 600 works of modern art, from artists like Picasso, Kandinsky, Chagall, and Klee, and they launched the Degenerate Art Exhibition. But this wasn't your typical art show. The goal wasn't to admire these works, it was to ridicule them. They hung the paintings crooked, slapped them with nasty captions, and surrounded them with slogans designed to make the public hate what they saw. It was a propaganda campaign, plain and simple. The message was clear: this kind of art had no place in Nazi Germany. And people showed up. Oh boy, did they show up. Over 2 million people visited the exhibition, not to appreciate the art, but to be told that these works were a threat to the German way of life. This wasn't just about controlling the art world, it was a part of the Nazis' plan to cleanse Germany of anything that didn't fit their vision of a pure, orderly, Aryan society. But the real story isn't just in the policies or exhibitions, it's in the lives that were shattered by them. Artists whose works didn't fit the Nazi vision weren't just ridiculed, their careers were destroyed, their works were confiscated, and, in some cases, their lives were changed forever. Let's look at 3 artists whose stories show just how far the Nazis were willing to go to suppress what they couldn't control. Hey, before we dive into these tragic, personal stories, consider subscribing, it helps me keep going. Let's start with a painting you already seen, The Prophet. It's the image I used in the thumbnail. That bold, haunting woodcut was created by Emil Nolde, one of the most famous expressionist artists in Germany. But here's where his story gets complicated. Nolde wasn't just an artist, he was also a supporter of the Nazi Party. You'd think that would have protected him, right? Wrong. The Nazis had very strict ideas about what art should look like. Perfect, heroic, and traditional. Nolde's work, with its exaggerated forms and intense colors, didn't fit the bill. His art was emotional, abstract, and raw, which made it dangerous in the eyes of the regime. In 1937, many of Nolde's works were seized and put on display in the Degenerate Art Exhibition, and despite his loyalty to the party, Nolde was labeled a degenerate artist. It gets worse. The Nazis didn't just condemn his work, they banned him from painting altogether. He wasn't even allowed to paint in private, but Nolde didn't stop. He continued creating in secret, producing what he called his unpainted pictures, pieces that wouldn't be revealed until after the fall of the Nazi regime. Nolde's story shows that even political loyalty couldn't protect you if your art didn't fit the regime's narrow ideals. Next up is Max Beckmann. If Nolde's story shows the irony of loyalty, Beckmann's story is about the price of defiance. Beckmann was one of Germany's most celebrated modern painters, but his works didn't exactly fit with the Nazi vision of art. His paintings were dark, intense, and full of psychological depth. Nothing like the heroic, idealized figures the Nazis wanted to promote. Beckmann's art often explored the human condition, authority, and the absurdity of life, which made it a perfect target for Nazi condemnation. In 1937, just like Nolde, Beckmann's works were seized and included in the Degenerate Art Exhibition. But for Beckmann, it wasn't about having his art mocked. He knew his days in Germany were numbered. The day after the Degenerate Art Exhibition opened, Beckmann fled the country. He and his wife packed their bags and left for Amsterdam, knowing that staying in Germany could mean the end of his career, or worse. In exile, he continued to paint, but the trauma of being uprooted from his home country was something that stayed with him for the rest of his life. For Beckmann, exile wasn't just a new place to live, it was a forced separation from his country, his identity, and everything he had built. Finally, there's Ernst Ludwig Kirchner. If Nolde's and Beckmann's stories were about survival, Kirchner's is a tragic end. Kirchner was a leading figure in the German Expressionist movement, and his work was full of vibrant color, bold lines, and psychological depth. But just like the others, his art didn't fit into the Nazi idea of perfection. It was far too raw, too distorted, and it showed the darker side of the human experience. Kirchner's art often explored the anxiety and trauma of modern life, especially the horrors of war. And for a regime obsessed with projecting strength and unity, Kirchner's unflinching look at the world was unacceptable. In 1937, more than 600 of his works were seized by the Nazis, and some of them displayed in the Degenerate Art Exhibition. For Kirchner, this public humiliation was a devastating blow. But it wasn't just about the art being confiscated, it was about the destruction of his life's work and his identity as an artist. The constant pressure, persecution, and rejection took a toll on Kirchner's mental health. And in 1938, just a year after his works were labeled degenerate, Kirchner took his own life. Kirchner's story shows just how destructive the Nazi regime was, not just to art, but to the people who created it. His life and work were casualties of the Nazis' relentless push to control everything, even the imagination. So, what happened after the Degenerate Art Exhibition? Well, for artists like Nolde, Beckmann, and Kirchner, the damage was done. Their works were confiscated, their careers derailed, and their lives were forever changed. But the legacy of this exhibition goes beyond just these artists. It's a story about the resilience of art in the face of extreme oppression. The Nazis wanted to erase modern art from German culture, but they didn't succeed. After the war, many works labeled as degenerate were recovered, but thousands more were lost or destroyed. And here's the irony. The very art the Nazis tried to suppress is now celebrated around the world. Artists like Picasso, Kandinsky, Chagall, and Paul Klee, once branded as corrupt and dangerous, are now recognized as some of the most influential figures in modern art. But why should we care about what happened in 1937? Because the fight to control art, to silent voices that challenge power, didn't end with the Nazis. It's still happening today, in different forms, all over the world. The same questions, what can be said, what should be silenced, are being asked right now, and the stakes are just as high. Let's look at some of the artists who are facing this struggle today. Take Ai Weiwei, for example. The Chinese artist and activist is known for challenging his government's policies, from human rights abuses to censorship itself. His art installations and sculptures make bold political statements, and because of that, he's been arrested, surveilled, and had his work censored. But has that stopped him? No, he continues to create art that challenges the system, knowing that his voice, like the voices of the artists in the Degenerate Art Exhibition, can't be easily silenced. Or think about Pussy Riot in Russia. Their performances directly criticize the Russian government and its policies, using art to protest. They've been jailed, harassed, and constantly face danger, but they keep pushing forward. So what does all of this tell us? The Nazis failed to silence the artists they tried to destroy, and history has shown us that no regime can truly suppress creativity. Whenever it's in Nazi Germany, modern-day China, or Russia, art has a way of surviving. It challenges, it provokes, and it resists. The Degenerate Art Exhibition is more than just a moment in history. It's a reminder that when regimes try to control art, they're often the ones who end up forgotten, while the art they try to suppress lives on. And today, more than ever, protecting artistic freedom is essential. Hey, you've seen how the Nazis wanted to manipulate their nation. Check out my other video where me and Plato uncover how influencers like Tate, Paul, and Peterson manipulate their audiences.